The stone wouldn't move. Thomas Brennan had broken through foundation walls in a dozen buildings across Boston, but this limestone slab felt different, heavier, colder, resistant in a way that made his crowbar slip twice before he adjusted his grip. It was March of 1924, 43 years after the Church of St. Agnes had first opened its doors to the faithful of the North End, and the Archdiocese had hired his demolition crew to expand the basement for a new charity kitchen. The morning fog still clung to the cobblestones outside when Thomas heard the crack, not of stone breaking, but of something beneath it shifting, settling, as if the earth itself was exhaling a breath it had held for decades. His crew of 5 men stood back as the slab tilted, revealing not the packed dirt they expected, but a hollow space. The smell hit them first, not decay that would have faded long ago, but something stale and mineral, like air trapped in a sealed tomb. Thomas lowered his lantern into the gap, and that's when he saw the first skull. Small, too small, resting atop a tangle of bones that reflected the lamplight in dull ivory. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Behind him, young Patrick Donnelly crossed himself and whispered a prayer in Irish Gaelic his grandmother had taught him. Within 2 hours, the police had cordoned off the church. By afternoon, Detective William Ashford of the Boston Police Department stood in that basement with the parish priest, Father Edmund Carr, whose face had gone the color of altar candles. The medical examiner, Dr. Harold Pierce, crouched beside the excavated pit with calipers and notebooks, counting ribs and measuring femurs with the detached precision of a man who had seen too much death to let it shake him anymore. But even Pierce's hands trembled slightly as he recorded the measurements. These were children's bones. Many children. The news spread through the immigrant neighborhoods like wildfire through dry timber. By evening, mothers who had lost sons and daughters decades ago stood outside the police barriers, holding photographs printed on cheap paper, edges worn from years of desperate touching. Mrs. Catherine O'Brien clutched a tintype of her boy Michael, who had vanished in the winter of 1881 when he was just 10 years old. She had been told he ran away, that boys from poor families often did, seeking fortune in the textile mills of Lowell or the factories of Worcester. But Michael wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. She had known it then, and she knew it now, standing in the March cold with her adult daughters, supporting her trembling frame. Dr. Pierce worked through the night, cataloguing each skeleton with meticulous care. He counted 37 sets of remains, all children between the approximate ages of 8 and 14. The bones showed signs of malnutrition, growth interruptions visible in the long bones, dental problems evident in the small skulls that grinned up at him from the excavation. But it was the fractures that told the real story. Compression fractures in spines, healed breaks in arms and legs, rib fractures that spoke of crushing injuries. These children hadn't died peacefully. They had labored, and that labor had broken them. Detective Ashford requested the church records from Father Carr, who produced them with shaking hands. The leather-bound ledgers documented baptisms, marriages, funerals, and financial transactions dating back to the church's founding. The construction records from 1881 listed payments to contractors, purchases of limestone and timber, invoices for stained glass shipped from New York. But there was something odd about the labor costs. They were too low. A church of this size, with its vaulted ceilings and intricate stonework, should have cost twice what the ledgers reported. Someone had built St. Agnes on the cheap. Ashford found what he was looking for in a side notation dated August 1881, written in faded ink. Labor arrangement finalized with Mr. Garrett Sullivan, foreman. Terms agreed per verbal contract. Children from the Mercy Street home to assist with foundation work and stone transport. No wages required. Fulfillment of Christian duty. The detective read the line 3 times, his jaw tightening with each repetition. The Mercy Street home had been an orphanage run by the Sisters of Charity. It had burned down in 1883, and its records had been lost in the fire. How convenient. As dawn broke over Boston, casting pale light through the church's stained glass windows, Thomas Brennan sat on the front steps, smoking a cigarette, with hands that hadn't stopped shaking. He had built and demolished structures across New England for 20 years, but he had never uncovered a tomb. The church bells, which normally rang at 6 o'clock for morning mass, remained silent. Father Carr had cancelled all services indefinitely. The Church of St. Agnes, once a symbol of faith and community, had become a crime scene, and somewhere in those yellowed ledgers and coded notations lay the answer to a question that had haunted dozens of immigrant families for 43 years. What happened to their children? Garrett Sullivan arrived in Boston in the spring of 1880 with nothing but a letter of introduction from a quarrymaster in Vermont and a reputation for finishing construction projects under budget. He was a compact man, with the thick forearms of someone who had spent decades handling stone, and eyes that assessed everything: buildings, materials, people, for their utility and cost. The city was in the midst of a building boom, churches rising alongside tenement blocks as waves of Irish, Italian, and Polish immigrants poured into the North End, seeking work in the factories and dockyards that lined the harbor. The Catholic Diocese of Boston needed men like Sullivan. They had ambitious plans to establish churches in every immigrant neighborhood, places where the faithful could worship in their native languages and maintain connections to the old country. Father Thomas Brennan, no relation to the demolition worker who would later discover the bones, had been assigned to oversee the construction of a new church on Hanover Street. He was young for such responsibility, only 32, but he had proven himself capable of raising funds from wealthy Protestant donors who appreciated his diplomatic manner and his promises that the church would provide moral education to the immigrant poor, keeping them orderly and industrious. Father Brennan met with Sullivan in June of 1880 in the diocese office on Franklin Street. The architect's drawings for St. Agnes, spread across the mahogany desk, showed a modest but elegant structure in the Gothic Revival style. Pointed arches, a bell tower, limestone facade, seating for 300. The estimated cost was $28,000, a sum that made Father Brennan's stomach clench. The diocese had approved only $18,000. He needed to build the church for less, much less, or the project would be cancelled and he would be reassigned to some rural parish where his ambitions would wither like unwatered plants. Sullivan studied the drawings with the careful attention of a man reading a map to buried treasure. He ran his calloused fingers over the architect's renderings, calculating dimensions and material quantities in his head. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the flat vowels of rural New England. He could build it for $16,000, he said, if Father Brennan was willing to be flexible about certain aspects of the labor arrangements. The priest leaned forward, interested. Sullivan explained that he had connections with the Mercy Street orphanage, where Sister Mary Catherine oversaw nearly 60 children, most of them Irish immigrants, who had lost parents to disease or workplace accidents. These children needed training in practical trades. What better education than learning construction skills while contributing to the building of a house of God? Father Brennan hesitated. Using children for construction work wasn't unusual. Boys as young as 8 worked in factories throughout Boston, and the law placed few restrictions on their employment. But there was something in Sullivan's tone, a calculated quality, that made him uneasy. Sullivan pressed his advantage. The children would learn masonry, carpentry, and other valuable skills. They would be fed and sheltered. The church would be fulfilling its charitable mission while saving enough money to add stained glass windows and a proper organ. It was, Sullivan insisted, an arrangement that served everyone's interests. The priest agreed, though he insisted on certain conditions. The children were to be treated fairly. They were to attend morning mass before work began. They were to receive adequate food and rest. Sullivan nodded at each requirement, his expression neutral, and Father Brennan chose to interpret the silence as consent. They signed the contract in July, and by August, preliminary excavation for the foundation had begun. Sullivan hired a crew of 8 adult laborers, Irish and Italian men desperate enough for work that they wouldn't ask questions about the children who appeared each morning at dawn, ranging in age from 8 to 14. The foreman told them the orphans were there to learn trades, and most of the men accepted this explanation because they needed their wages and knew better than to challenge arrangements made by the church. A few workers, like Michael Doherty, a stonemason from County Cork, felt uncomfortable watching children younger than his own sons hauling stones and mixing mortar in the summer heat. But Doherty had 5 mouths to feed at home, and jobs were scarce. He kept his concerns to himself, Sister Mary Catherine delivered the first group of 12 children to the construction site on August 9, 1880. They were thin, quiet, and obedient in the way that orphaned children learn to be. Sullivan assigned them tasks based on size and strength. The older boys hauled wheelbarrows of gravel and sand. The younger ones sorted stones and carried water to the adult workers. None of them spoke unless spoken to. None of them complained. They had learned in the orphanage that complaints led to missed meals and basement isolation. Here at least they worked in open air under the summer sun, and Sullivan's assistant distributed bread and cheese at midday. It seemed at first like it might be the opportunity Father Brennan had promised, a chance to learn, to contribute, to belong to something larger than their own small, forgotten lives. But Sullivan had other plans, plans that had nothing to do with education or Christian charity. The children from Mercy Street Orphanage knew hunger as intimately as their own names. They knew cold that penetrated thin blankets on winter nights, and they knew the particular silence that falls over a room of abandoned children who have learned that crying brings punishment rather than comfort. But the work at St. Agnes introduced them to a different kind of suffering, the bone-deep exhaustion of labor that began before sunrise and ended after dark, the burning in muscles pushed beyond their capacity, the accidents that happened when small hands attempted tasks designed for grown men. Michael O'Brien was 10 years old when Sister Mary Catherine selected him for the construction crew. He had arrived at Mercy Street 2 years earlier after his father died in a dockyard accident and his mother succumbed to tuberculosis 3 months later. He was a sturdy boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's broad shoulders, already showing signs of the man he might become if he survived childhood. Sullivan noticed this strength and assigned Michael to the foundation crew, where he spent his days in the excavated pit beneath what would become the church, hauling stones that weighed nearly as much as he did. The foundation work was the most dangerous part of the construction. The pit was 15 feet deep, supported by wooden timbers that creaked ominously when the earth settled. Adult workers refused to spend extended time in the excavation, citing the instability and the risk of collapse. So Sullivan sent the children down instead. They were smaller, he reasoned, and could navigate the narrow spaces between support beams more easily. He paid them no wages, their labor was donated by the orphanage as part of their Christian education, and he provided minimal safety precautions. No ropes, no harnesses, no backup supports, just children and stone and the constant threat of cave-in. The first serious accident happened in September. A boy named Thomas McCarthy, only 9 years old, was crushed when a limestone block slipped from its moorings and pinned his legs. The adult workers heard his screams and pulled him free, but both legs were broken, the right one so badly that bone fragments pierced the skin. Sullivan sent him back to the orphanage with instructions to Sister Mary Catherine that the boy had been injured through his own clumsiness. Thomas never recovered properly. He would walk with a severe limp for the rest of his shortened life, and he would never speak of what happened in the foundation pit of St. Agnes. But Sullivan needed more workers. Thomas's injury meant one less set of hands, and the construction timeline was aggressive. Father Brennan visited the site weekly, but Sullivan made sure these inspections occurred during lunch breaks, or at times when the children were performing light tasks above ground. The priest saw orphans learning to cut wooden beams and mix mortar under adult supervision. He didn't see the foundation pit. He didn't see the boys descending into that earthen tomb each morning, their faces grey with exhaustion and fear. He saw what Sullivan wanted him to see, a charitable program succeeding, a church rising on schedule and under budget. Sister Mary Catherine delivered more children throughout the fall. She was a severe woman who believed suffering purified the soul, and that idle hands invited the devil's influence. When Sullivan requested additional workers, she complied without question. The orphanage was overcrowded, resources were scarce, and the arrangement with Sullivan provided one less meal to prepare, one less mouth to feed for each child sent to the construction site. She told herself she was providing opportunity. She told herself the children were learning valuable trades, but she never visited the site. She never asked detailed questions about the work. She accepted Sullivan's reassurances and his occasional donations to the orphanage fund, money that came from the savings he generated by using unpaid child labor instead of hiring additional adult workers. By November, the foundation was complete, and the walls were rising. The weather turned cold, and the children worked through rain and early snow, their thin clothes inadequate against the New England autumn. Several fell ill. Mary Margaret Sullivan, no relation to Garrett, developed pneumonia and died in the orphanage infirmary, having never mentioned the lung damage caused by breathing limestone dust for 3 months. She was 11. Patrick Riley collapsed from exhaustion and struck his head on a granite cornerstone. He died 2 days later without regaining consciousness. He was 12. Sister Mary Catherine recorded their deaths in the orphanage ledger as natural causes, an act of God, claiming their innocent souls for heaven. Michael O'Brien watched his fellow orphans suffer and die, and he felt something hardening inside him. Not quite anger, because anger required hope that things could be different, but a cold acceptance that this was what life offered children like them. No one would save them. No one was coming. They would work until they couldn't work anymore, and then they would be replaced by other forgotten children from the endless supply that poverty and disease delivered to places like Mercy Street. The Church of St. Agnes would rise, beautiful and sacred, and no one would remember the small bodies that helped lift its stones. No one would count the cost paid in young bones and shortened lives, unless something changed, unless someone saw what was really happening and found the courage to stop it. Winter arrived early in 1880, bringing with it storms that turned the construction site into a treacherous landscape of frozen mud and ice-slicked stones. Sullivan pushed the work forward despite the dangerous conditions. He had promised Father Brennan the church would be ready for dedication by Easter, and delays meant cost overruns he couldn't afford. The adult workers grumbled but complied, needing their wages too desperately to protest. The children had no choice at all. They appeared each morning, thinner now, their hands wrapped in strips of cloth that did little to protect against the cold stone and metal tools. The bell tower construction began in December, requiring stones to be hauled to the upper levels of the church structure. Sullivan devised a pulley system operated from the ground, with workers on scaffolding guiding the stones into place. It was efficient but dangerous, requiring precise coordination between the ground crew and the masons working 40 feet above. He assigned the older orphans to the ground crew, including Michael O'Brien, now 11, and a 15-year-old named James Walsh, who had been at Mercy Street since infancy. James was the closest thing the orphans had to a leader. He was tall for his age, with the gaunt frame of someone who had never eaten enough, but possessed a quiet authority that made other children trust him. He had watched the injuries mount throughout the fall, had held Thomas McCarthy's hand while they waited for the doctor who never came, had helped bury Mary Margaret Sullivan in the orphanage cemetery. James understood what Michael was only beginning to grasp, that Sullivan saw them as expendable resources, no different from the lumber and stone, to be used until they broke and then replaced. On a bitter morning in January, James made a decision that would determine the fate of everyone at the construction site. He approached Michael Doherty, the stonemason from County Cork, during the midday break. The adult workers sat apart from the children, eating their lunches and stamping their feet against the cold. James stood at the edge of their circle, his thin face serious, and asked to speak with Doherty privately. The stonemason followed him to a corner of the site, where James described in precise detail what happened in the foundation pit, the accident Sullivan hid from Father Brennan, the children who had died or been permanently injured. He spoke without emotion, presenting facts like evidence in a trial, because he knew emotion could be dismissed as childish exaggeration. Doherty listened with growing horror. He had suspected something was wrong, but he had told himself it wasn't his place to interfere, that the church authorities must know what they were permitting. Now confronted with the truth spoken plainly by a boy who should have been in school rather than hauling stones, he felt shame burning through his chest. He asked James what he wanted him to do. James's answer was simple: talk to Father Brennan, show him what was really happening, make him see. But James knew the priest might not listen to a laborer, might dismiss it as troublemaking or misunderstanding. They needed evidence, something undeniable. That evidence came 3 days later, when the pulley system failed. A limestone block weighing nearly 300 pounds broke free from its rigging and plummeted toward the ground crew. Michael O'Brien saw it falling and shouted a warning, but there was no time to scatter. The stone struck 2 children, Catherine Flynn, age 9, and her brother Patrick, age 12. The impact killed Catherine instantly. Patrick survived with a crushed pelvis and internal injuries that would claim his life 2 days later at Massachusetts General Hospital. This time there were witnesses. This time adult workers saw everything. This time the police came to the construction site, not just to document an accident but to investigate. The officers questioned Sullivan, who blamed faulty equipment and worker error. They questioned the adult laborers, who confirmed the accident but were reluctant to discuss the broader pattern of child endangerment. Most still feared losing their jobs. But they questioned Michael Doherty, and the stonemason had reached his limit. He told them everything James Walsh had told him. He described the foundation pit, the inadequate safety measures, the children working beyond their capacity. He named the orphans who had died or been injured. He produced the work schedules showing children laboring 12-hour days in freezing weather. Father Brennan learned of the investigation when police detectives appeared at the diocese office, requesting the construction contracts and correspondence with Sullivan. The young priest, who had convinced himself that he was providing opportunity to unfortunate children, read through the police reports with a dawning recognition of what his ambition and willful blindness had permitted. The evidence was overwhelming. Sullivan had systematically exploited the orphans, cutting costs by using free child labor in the most dangerous positions while hiding the casualties from church oversight. And Father Brennan had let it happen because the project was coming in under budget and on schedule, because it would advance his career, because he hadn't asked the hard questions whose answers might require him to act. The Archdiocese moved quickly to contain the scandal. They suspended construction on St. Agnes. They fired Garrett Sullivan and banned him from future church contracts. They launched an internal investigation of the Mercy Street orphanage and removed Sister Mary Catherine from her position. But the damage was done. 37 children had died during the 6 months of construction, some from accidents, others from illness and exhaustion, a few who simply vanished and were later assumed to have run away. Their bodies were never properly buried, never given funerals, never mourned publicly. Sullivan had disposed of them quietly at night, in unmarked graves beneath the church foundation. The Archdiocese's internal investigation concluded in February of 1881 with findings that were quietly buried in sealed files at the diocese office. The report acknowledged that children from Mercy Street Orphanage had died during construction of St. Agnes, but attributed the deaths to unfortunate accidents, the hazards of industrial-era life, and the children's own recklessness. It made no mention of systematic exploitation or criminal negligence. It recommended no prosecutions. Instead, it suggested reforms, better oversight of future construction projects, written contracts specifying labor conditions, regular inspections by church officials. These recommendations gathered dust in filing cabinets, while the real work of managing the scandal proceeded. Father Brennan received a transfer to a parish in western Massachusetts, officially described as a promotion, but understood by everyone involved as exile. He would spend the next 40 years ministering to a rural congregation, his ambitions for advancement within the church hierarchy permanently extinguished. He never spoke publicly about St. Agnes, but those who knew him in his later years described a man haunted by guilt, who drank too much and spent long hours in the confessional seeking absolution for sins he couldn't name. Sister Mary Catherine was removed from Mercy Street Orphanage and reassigned to a convent in Maine, where she lived in cloistered silence until her death in 1903. The orphanage itself was reorganized under new management, with stricter regulations about releasing children for outside work. But the changes came too late for the 37 who had perished, and too late for the dozens of others who survived with permanent injuries and psychological scars that would shape the remainder of their lives. Garrett Sullivan disappeared. Police investigators searched for him throughout the spring of 1881, but he had vanished as thoroughly as the children he had destroyed. Some believed he fled west, perhaps to California or the mining territories, where men with questionable pasts could reinvent themselves. Others whispered that he had met a darker fate, that Michael Doherty or another of the adult workers had taken justice into their own hands. No body was ever found. No arrest was ever made. Sullivan became a ghost, his name spoken only in hushed conversations among those who remembered. The construction of St. Agnes resumed in May of 1881 under new management. The Archdiocese hired a reputable contractor from Providence who brought his own crew of adult workers and completed the church using proper labor practices and safety measures. The project took longer and cost more than originally budgeted, but it was finished without additional casualties. The foundation, where 37 small bodies lay hidden beneath limestone and mortar, was never excavated again. The new contractor built over it, sealing the children's graves beneath the church floor. Father James McCormick, a respected priest in his 50s, was assigned to St. Agnes as its first permanent pastor. He knew nothing of the construction scandal. The Archdiocese had decided that information was too sensitive to share widely, even among clergy. He arrived in September and found a beautiful church, its Gothic arches soaring upward, its stained glass windows casting colored light across wooden pews. He found a congregation eager for spiritual guidance, immigrant families who worked grueling hours in factories and needed their faith to make sense of hardship. He found no trace of the tragedy that had occurred during the building's construction. The dedication ceremony took place on Easter Sunday, 1882. Bishop John Williams presided over a mass attended by 300 people, the church filled to capacity with Irish, Italian, and Polish Catholics who saw St. Agnes as proof of their community's growing permanence in Boston. The bishop blessed the altar, blessed the congregation, blessed the building itself without knowing the dead children beneath his feet. The choir sang hymns. Children, living children from the parish, served as altar boys and scattered flower petals. It was a celebration of faith and community, beautiful and moving, built on a foundation of bones and lies. Among the congregation that Easter morning sat Catherine O'Brien, who had lost her son Michael in the construction. She attended because she was a devout Catholic who believed in the church's authority and sacraments, but also because she harbored a desperate hope that perhaps somehow her Michael was still alive. Perhaps he had run away and would return someday. Perhaps the rumors about construction accidents were exaggerated. She knelt and prayed in a church built with her son's labor and death, and she would continue to pray there every Sunday for the next 30 years, never knowing the truth. James Walsh survived the construction. He was released from the orphanage at age 16 and found work as a stonemason, the trade he had learned at St. Agnes. He married, had children, and became a foreman for a construction company that prided itself on safety and fair labor practices. He never forgot the friends he had lost, and he carried their memory as a weight that shaped every decision he made. When his own son asked him why he was so strict about safety regulations, James would only say that he had seen what happened when corners were cut, when profit mattered more than human life. He never attended services at St. Agnes. He couldn't bring himself to enter that building knowing what lay beneath it. The decades that followed the dedication of St. Agnes were marked by a collective amnesia, a communal decision, conscious or unconscious, to forget the children who had built the church. The immigrant neighborhoods of Boston's North End were places where people focused on survival rather than historical reckoning. Families worked 12-hour shifts in factories, struggled to pay rent, fought against poverty and prejudice. They had neither the time nor the resources to investigate past tragedies, especially when those investigations might challenge the institution that provided them with spiritual comfort and social services. The sealed Archdiocese files remained sealed. The families who had lost children to the construction were told their sons and daughters had run away, or had died of natural causes, or had been placed with families in other cities. Some accepted these explanations because they had no alternative. Others, like Catherine O'Brien, suspected the truth but lacked the means to prove it. There were no investigative journalists looking into the story, no reform organizations demanding accountability. The progressive movements that would eventually address child labor abuses were still gathering momentum in the 1880s and 1890s, focused primarily on factory conditions rather than construction sites. Michael Doherty, the stonemason who had spoken to the police in 1881, found himself blacklisted from church construction projects throughout New England. Word spread quietly among contractors that he was a troublemaker. someone who couldn't be trusted to keep his mouth shut. He eventually moved to Pennsylvania to find work in the coal mines, trading one dangerous occupation for another. He died in a mine collapse in 1894, leaving behind a widow and 5 children. Before his death, he wrote a detailed account of what he had witnessed at St. Agnes and gave it to his oldest son, with instructions to make it public if the opportunity ever arose. That document survived in the Doherty family for generations, passed down like a dangerous heirloom. The Church of St. Agnes thrived. Father McCormick proved to be an effective pastor, beloved by his congregation for his compassion and his willingness to advocate for immigrant rights. The church became a center of community life, hosting not just religious services, but also English classes, job placement services, and charitable programs for the poor. The parish grew from 300 families in 1882 to over 800 by 1900. No one who worshipped there knew they were praying above a mass grave. No plaques commemorated the children who had died. No memorial services honored their sacrifice. The orphans who survived the construction scattered across the country. Some, like James Walsh, remained in Boston and built successful lives despite the trauma they carried. Others disappeared into the vast anonymity of industrial America, becoming factory workers, domestic servants, soldiers, drifters. A few ended up in prisons or asylums, their childhood experiences having damaged them beyond repair. Most never spoke of what had happened at St. Agnes. The culture of the era didn't encourage discussions of trauma or provide vocabulary for psychological injury. They simply endured, carrying their memories in silence. In 1899, a reporter for the Boston Herald heard rumors about the St. Agnes construction and began investigating. He tracked down several survivors, including James Walsh, and collected their testimonies. He requested access to the archdiocese files and was denied. He attempted to interview church officials and was told the allegations were baseless slander against a sacred institution. His editor, under pressure from the archdiocese and concerned about litigation, killed the story. The reporter's notes ended up in a trunk in his attic, where they remained undiscovered until after his death in 1923. The turn of the century brought progressive-era reforms that addressed child labor in factories and mines. Massachusetts passed stronger child labor laws, limiting working hours and raising minimum age requirements. But these reforms came too late for the children of St. Agnes, and they contained loopholes that still allowed exploitation in certain industries. Construction work, especially on private projects, remained poorly regulated. The reforms also did nothing to address past abuses or demand accountability for crimes already committed. By 1920, most of the people directly connected to the St. Agnes construction were dead. Father Brennan died in 1918, Sister Mary Catherine in 1903, Michael Doherty in 1894. Bishop Williams, who had dedicated the church, died in 1907. The adult workers who had witnessed the abuses had mostly passed away or moved on. The surviving orphans were now in their 50s and 60s, and many had died young from the injuries and illnesses they had sustained. The institutional memory was fading, and with it the possibility of justice seemed to fade as well. But Catherine O'Brien kept searching. Even in her 70s, she made inquiries about her son Michael, writing letters to orphanages and police departments, asking if anyone had records of a boy who had disappeared in 1880. She received polite responses that led nowhere. She continued to attend St. Agnes every Sunday, lighting candles for her lost son, praying for answers she would not live to receive. She died in 1922 at age 78, still not knowing that Michael's bones lay beneath the church floor, that she had been praying above his grave for 40 years. The discovery in March of 1924 shattered the carefully maintained silence. Thomas Brennan's demolition crew had inadvertently opened a door that the archdiocese had sealed 43 years earlier, and once opened, it could not be closed again. The Boston newspapers seized the story with the sensationalism typical of the era, running headlines that screamed about the church built on bones and murdered orphans beneath sacred ground. The public reaction was immediate and visceral: horror, outrage, and demands for answers. Detective William Ashford led the investigation with a thoroughness that reflected both his professional dedication and his personal fury at what had been done to children. He was a father himself, with 3 daughters, and the thought of young people being worked to death and then buried in secret graves offended everything he believed about justice and decency. He assembled a team of investigators, medical examiners, and forensic specialists, primitive by later standards but cutting edge for 1924, to document the remains and determine exactly what had happened. Dr. Harold Pierce spent 3 weeks in that basement, carefully excavating and cataloguing each skeleton. He determined that all 37 were children between the ages of 8 and 14, consistent with the orphanage population. The bones showed evidence of malnutrition, repetitive stress injuries, and trauma consistent with construction accidents. Several skulls showed fractures from falling objects. Multiple skeletons had compression fractures in the spine from carrying heavy loads. The medical evidence painted a clear picture of systematic child labor exploitation that had resulted in death. The Archdiocese initially attempted to manage the scandal through denial and deflection. A spokesman issued a statement expressing shock and sympathy, claiming that current church leadership had no knowledge of these events and that any improprieties were the actions of individuals rather than institutional policy. They offered prayers for the deceased children and their families. They did not, however, open their sealed files or cooperate fully with the police investigation. Detective Ashford had to obtain court orders to access the 1881 construction records and internal investigation documents. When those files finally became public in April, the full scope of the cover-up became clear. The documents showed that church leadership in 1881 had known about the deaths, had investigated them, and had deliberately concealed the findings to protect the institution's reputation. The Archdiocese had paid off some families with small sums of money in exchange for their silence. They had destroyed records from Mercy Street Orphanage after the fire in 1883, ensuring that documentation of which children had been assigned to construction work no longer existed. They had facilitated Garrett Sullivan's disappearance by not cooperating fully with the initial police investigation. The public outcry intensified. Protestants who had long harbored suspicions about Catholic institutions used the scandal to vindicate their prejudices. Immigrant Catholics felt betrayed by the church they had trusted to protect their communities. Reform organizations demanded criminal prosecutions, even though most of the responsible parties were long dead. The newspapers ran daily updates, interviewing surviving orphans who were now elderly but willing to tell their stories for the first time. James Walsh, now 64 years old and semi-retired, agreed to an interview with the Boston Globe. He described in careful detail what had happened during those months in 1880 and 1881, the dangerous conditions, the inadequate safety measures, the injuries and deaths that Sullivan had hidden. He named the children he remembered, gave descriptions that helped with identification. He explained why he and others had remained silent for so long: fear, powerlessness, and the knowledge that no one would believe orphans over church authorities. His testimony was powerful precisely because it was restrained, factual, absent of hyperbole. He was a credible witness, with nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking out. Detective Ashford's investigation also uncovered the document that Michael Doherty had written before his death in 1894. Doherty's son, now in his 50s, read about the discovery in the newspapers and contacted the police with his father's account. The handwritten pages corroborated everything James Walsh had said and provided additional details about Sullivan's methods and Father Brennan's willful ignorance. It was evidence that could have led to prosecutions in 1881, but had been buried by institutional indifference and individual fear. The identification process proved challenging, but not impossible. Dr. Pierce used anthropological techniques to estimate age, sex, and in some cases ancestry from skeletal remains. Detective Ashford cross-referenced these findings with orphanage records that had survived in other institutions and with the testimonies of surviving workers and orphans. By May, they had tentatively identified 23 of the 37 children. Michael O'Brien was among them, identified by age, height estimates, and the location of his remains near other children that James Walsh remembered working with. Catherine O'Brien's daughter Mary, now 52 years old, learned that her brother's remains had been found. She visited the church, standing at the barrier around the excavation site, and wept for the brother she barely remembered, and the mother who had died without knowing the truth. She told reporters that her mother had always known something was wrong, that Michael wouldn't have simply run away. Vindication came too late for Catherine, but at least the not knowing had ended. The final chapter of the St. Agnes tragedy unfolded through the summer and fall of 1924, as Boston grappled with how to provide justice for crimes committed 4 decades earlier. The legal reality was frustrating. Most of the responsible parties were dead, and statutes of limitations had long since expired for those who remained alive. No criminal prosecutions would occur. The institutional accountability that reform advocates demanded proved difficult to achieve when the institution insisted it bore no responsibility for the actions of rogue individuals acting against church policy. But something had shifted in American society between 1881 and 1924. The Progressive Era reforms, the growing power of labor unions, the increasing professionalization of social work and child welfare, all these changes meant that what the Archdiocese had covered up in 1881 could no longer be ignored in 1924. Public pressure forced the Church to take meaningful action, even without the threat of criminal prosecution. In June, the Archbishop of Boston issued a formal apology, acknowledging the Church's failure to protect the children and accepting institutional responsibility for the tragedy. It was unprecedented, an admission of wrongdoing by an institution that rarely conceded fault. The Archdiocese established a fund to provide compensation to surviving orphans who had worked on the St. Agnes construction and to the families of the deceased children. The amounts were modest by any standard, but the gesture itself mattered, official recognition that harm had been done and that some form of restitution was owed. James Walsh received a payment that he immediately donated to organizations working to improve child labor laws. He told reporters he didn't want money. He wanted the Church to ensure that nothing like St. Agnes could ever happen again. The reburial of the 37 children became a moment of collective mourning and historical reckoning. The Archdiocese arranged for individual coffins and a proper Catholic funeral mass, held in September at a different church, not St. Agnes, which had been closed pending decisions about its future. Thousands attended the funeral, including elderly Irish immigrants who wept for children they had never known but whose story resonated with their own experiences of poverty and exploitation. The children were buried in a Catholic cemetery with a monument that listed their names, those that could be identified, and acknowledged those who remained unknown. The inscription read, "In memory of 37 children who labored and died in the building of St. Agnes Church, 1880-1881. May they rest in peace and may we remember." The fate of St. Agnes Church itself sparked intense debate. Some argued it should be demolished, that a building constructed through child exploitation could never be sacred. Others contended that destruction would erase the historical evidence and dishonor the memory of the children by pretending the tragedy had never occurred. The Archdiocese ultimately decided to deconsecrate the building, removing its status as a church, and convert it into a community center focused on child welfare services. It would serve children rather than bury them. The stained glass windows remained, but new plaques inside told the true story of the building's construction. Detective William Ashford closed his investigation in November of 1924 with a comprehensive report that documented everything he had uncovered. He recommended reforms to construction oversight, mandatory reporting of workplace deaths, and stronger enforcement of child labor laws. Some of these recommendations were implemented in Massachusetts over the following years, contributing to broader reforms that made the 1920s and 1930s a period of significant progress in child welfare law. The St. Agnes case became a reference point in reform debates, an example of what happened when institutions prioritized reputation over responsibility. James Walsh lived until 1941, long enough to see many of the reforms he had advocated become reality. In his final years, he spoke frequently to school groups and civic organizations about his experiences, using his story to educate a new generation about the importance of workplace safety and the protection of vulnerable populations. He never claimed to be a hero. He was simply, he said, someone who had survived when others hadn't, and who owed it to those others to tell the truth. He was buried near the monument to the 37 children, his tombstone bearing a simple inscription. He remembered. The story of St. Agnes faded from public consciousness after the 1920s, becoming a footnote in Labour history textbooks and a cautionary tale in discussions of institutional accountability. But the monument remained, visited occasionally by school groups and history enthusiasts. The building that had been the church continued operating as a community centre, serving children with programs that Catherine O'Brien and Michael Doherty would have approved of: education, safety, care. The 37 children who had laboured in anonymity and died in secret had finally received the acknowledgement they deserved, their names preserved, their story told. It was not the justice they should have received in life, but it was the only justice that 1924 could provide, and it mattered. Remembrance always matters. Truth always matters, even when it comes 43 years too late. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.